Imagine celebrating 40 years of marriage, only to vanish without a trace. In March 1982, Frank and Evelyn Donnelly set out to mark their ruby anniversary with a cross-country RV adventure, a journey they'd planned for months. But somewhere along the back roads of rural Louisiana, they simply disappeared. No distress calls, no witnesses, no clues. For 5 agonizing years, their family searched desperately for answers. Then, in 1987, a local fisherman made a chilling discovery deep in the bayou. Their Class C motorhome, submerged and barely recognizable. What investigators found inside would raise more questions than it answered. Before we begin, a quick like and subscribe is always appreciated. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Frank Donnelly was a retired postal worker from Cincinnati, Ohio. At 60 years old, he was known throughout his neighborhood as a meticulous man who kept detailed records of everything. His garage was organized with labels on every shelf, and his toolbox could have been featured in a magazine. Evelyn, 58, had worked as an elementary school librarian for 33 years. She was beloved by students and teachers alike, always ready with a warm smile and a book recommendation. Together, they raised 3 children who had all grown and moved away by 1982. Their friends described them as devoted to each other, the kind of couple that still held hands at the grocery store. They were careful planners, not the type to take unnecessary risks. So when they announced their anniversary trip, everyone thought it was perfectly in character. The Donnellys had been talking about this trip for nearly 2 years. Frank purchased a used 1978 Class C motorhome in the summer of 1981. He spent months fixing it up, replacing worn parts, and ensuring everything worked perfectly. Evelyn created an itinerary that covered 17 states over 6 weeks. They planned to visit national parks, historical landmarks, and small towns they'd always wanted to see. Their daughter, Patricia, later told investigators that her mother had compiled a thick binder with maps, campground reservations, and lists of attractions. Frank installed a Citizens Band radio in the RV for emergencies and made sure they had spare parts for common repairs. They weren't novice travelers either. The couple had taken several shorter RV trips over the previous year to get comfortable with the vehicle. Everything suggested they were as prepared as any travelers could be. On March 7, 1982, the Donnellys left Cincinnati on a sunny Sunday morning. Their son, Michael, stopped by that morning to say goodbye. He later recalled that his parents seemed excited but calm, exactly as they approached most things in life. Frank went through a final checklist, testing the lights, checking tire pressure, and reviewing their route one more time. Evelyn packed a cooler with sandwiches and fruit for the first few days on the road. They planned to head south through Kentucky and Tennessee before turning west toward Texas. Their first scheduled stop was a campground outside Nashville, about 270 miles away. Patricia received a phone call from her mother that evening confirming they'd arrived safely. Evelyn sounded happy, mentioning the beautiful countryside and mild weather. That call would be the last confirmed contact anyone had with either of them. For the first 10 days, the family received sporadic updates. Frank sent a postcard from Memphis, Tennessee, dated March 10th. The message was brief but cheerful, mentioning they'd visited Graceland and were heading toward Little Rock, Arkansas. Another postcard arrived from Michael's address, postmarked March 15th from Texarkana, Texas. Nothing in the messages suggested any problems. According to their itinerary, they should have been making good progress toward their planned stops in Texas and New Mexico. The family wasn't concerned about not hearing from them every day. Long-distance phone calls were expensive, and the Donnellys had mentioned they might not call frequently to save money. When March turned into April without further word, their children assumed their parents were simply enjoying their journey and would call when they reached a major destination. But as April progressed with no contact, unease began to settle in. By mid-April, Patricia tried calling several campgrounds her parents had reservations at. None of them had any record of the Donnellys checking in. She contacted the last campground they'd confirmed staying at, near Texarkana, and learned they departed on March 17th as planned. After that, the trail went cold. Michael drove to Cincinnati to check his parents' house. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. The mail had piled up, plants needed watering, but nothing appeared disturbed. On April 22nd, Patricia filed a missing persons report with the Cincinnati Police Department. The officer taking the report was sympathetic but explained that adults have the right to travel without checking in. However, given the Donnellys' reliable nature, he agreed to enter their information into the national database. The family also contacted the Postal Service, asking them to flag if any mail was forwarded or picked up anywhere. Nothing turned up. Detective Raymond Walsh was assigned to the case. A 20-year veteran of the Cincinnati Police Department, he'd handled his share of missing persons cases. Most ended with people being found safe, having simply lost track of time or deciding to extend their travels. But something about the Donnelly case bothered him from the start. He interviewed the children extensively, building a timeline of the last known contacts. He obtained the couple's bank records and discovered that their last transaction was on March 19th at a gas station in Shreveport, Louisiana. Frank had used his credit card to purchase $32 in fuel. After that date, there were no withdrawals, no charges, no activity whatsoever. Walsh contacted Louisiana authorities and learned that Shreveport was roughly 100 miles north of their next planned destination. But they never made it. The detective began the painstaking work of contacting every police department along their possible routes. Walsh sent bulletins to law enforcement agencies across Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. He included descriptions of both Frank and Evelyn, along with detailed information about their RV, a white 1978 Winnebago Chieftain with brown and orange stripes, Ohio license plates, and a distinctive crack in the passenger side windshield. He also reached out to hospitals, checking for any unidentified patients admitted around that time. The National Park Service was contacted since the Donnellys had planned to visit several parks in Texas and New Mexico. Rangers were asked to check registration records and be on the lookout for the vehicle. Patricia appeared on local Cincinnati news programs, holding up photos of her parents and their RV. The story ran in newspapers across the Midwest, but no useful leads emerged. Michael hired a private investigator who retraced the route his parents should have taken, stopping at gas stations and diners to show photos. Nobody remembered seeing them. As weeks turned into months, various theories emerged. Some suggested the Donnellys might have had an accident on a remote road, with the RV going off an embankment or into a body of water. Search teams checked accident reports and explored dangerous stretches of highway, but found nothing. Others wondered if they'd been victims of foul play, perhaps targeted by criminals who saw elderly travelers as easy marks. Detective Walsh investigated several reports of robberies and assaults along interstate highways in the region, but none matched the Donnellys' timeline or description. A more hopeful theory suggested they might have simply decided to start a new life somewhere, though this seemed completely out of character. Their bank accounts remained untouched, which would have been impossible if they were living somewhere under assumed names. Every lead that seemed promising ultimately led nowhere. By summer, the investigation had stalled completely, with no new information coming in. The Donnelly children struggled with the uncertainty. Patricia took a leave of absence from her teaching job, spending weeks traveling through Louisiana and Texas, putting up missing person flyers and talking to anyone who would listen. Michael coordinated with citizen volunteer search groups, organizing efforts to search remote areas where an accident might have gone unnoticed. Their youngest sibling, Thomas, managed the media appeals and maintained contact with law enforcement agencies. The emotional toll was immense. They couldn't grieve because they didn't know if their parents were dead. They couldn't move on because they didn't have answers. Holidays were especially difficult. Christmas 1982 came and went without any word. The house in Cincinnati sat empty, a shrine to a life interrupted. The children couldn't bring themselves to pack up their parents' belongings or make any permanent decisions. They existed in a painful limbo, hoping for a miracle while fearing the worst. By early 1983, the investigation had essentially stopped. Detective Walsh hadn't received any new information in months. He kept the file active and continued to check periodically for any updates, but without fresh leads, there was nothing more he could do. The Donnellys' case joined thousands of others in missing persons databases across the country. Occasionally, a body would be discovered somewhere, and Walsh would check to see if it might be Frank or Evelyn, but it never was. The family's private investigator exhausted his leads and had to admit he'd hit a wall. Patricia returned to work, though she struggled to focus. Michael visited his parents' house weekly, maintaining it as if they might return any day. The media lost interest as newer stories captured public attention. Friends and neighbors expressed sympathy, but didn't know what to say anymore. The Donnellys had simply vanished, as if they'd driven into another dimension. As years passed, the family tried to rebuild their lives while carrying the weight of not knowing. Patricia got married in 1984. She sent an invitation to her parents' address, a symbolic gesture that left her in tears. Michael's wife gave birth to their first child in 1985, a grandson Frank and Evelyn would never meet. Thomas moved to Atlanta for a new job opportunity. They stayed in close contact, calling each other on their parents' birthdays and anniversary to share memories and tears. Detective Walsh retired in 1986, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case. It was one of the few that had truly haunted him throughout his career. He kept a copy of the file at home, sometimes reviewing it on quiet evenings, hoping something he'd missed would suddenly become obvious. But the answers remained elusive, buried somewhere in the vast landscape of the American South. On June 14, 1987, everything changed. A local fisherman named Robert Hayes was working in a remote section of the Atchafalaya Basin, about 40 miles southwest of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Atchafalaya is one of the largest swamp systems in America, covering nearly 1 million acres of bayous, cypress swamps, and wetlands. Hayes knew these waters better than most, having fished there since childhood. He was checking his crawfish traps in an area that was rarely visited, accessible only by shallow draft boats. The water was low that summer due to a mild drought, exposing areas that were normally submerged. As Hayes navigated through a narrow channel lined with cypress trees, he noticed something unusual in the murky water ahead. At first, he thought it was an old boat that had sunk, but as he got closer, he realized it was a vehicle. The top portion was barely visible above the waterline, covered in algae and moss. Hayes immediately recognized this wasn't a typical abandoned vehicle. He marked the location on his navigation chart and headed back to the nearest boat launch, where he found a pay phone and called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Martin Cross responded to the call and met Hayes at the boat launch. Together, they returned to the site. Cross radioed for additional assistance, and within 2 hours, a recovery team had assembled. The Iberville Parish Sheriff's Department coordinated with state wildlife officers who had equipment suitable for swamp operations. A dive team arrived from Baton Rouge to assess the situation. The first diver who went down came up shaking his head. The vehicle was resting on a soft mud bottom in about 12 feet of water. It was indeed a recreational vehicle, and it had been there for a considerable time based on the growth covering it. The question everyone immediately asked was whether anyone was inside. The recovery operation was complex and delicate. The swamp floor was unstable, making it difficult to secure cables and chains. A barge with a crane was brought in, but it took nearly a full day to position it properly in the narrow channel. Divers worked carefully, clearing vegetation and securing straps around the RV's frame. There was significant concern about the vehicle's structural integrity. Years of submersion had likely weakened it considerably, and they feared it might break apart during the lifting process. On the morning of June 16th, the crane operator began the slow process of raising the vehicle. Water poured from every opening as it emerged. The site was eerie. The once white RV was now stained dark with mud and algae, its windows opaque with accumulated grime. The orange and brown stripes were barely visible. As it cleared the water completely, everyone held their breath. The RV was clearly old and had been submerged for years. Once the RV was secured on the barge, investigators cautiously approached it. The door was closed but not locked. Detective Lawrence Bennett from the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Department carefully opened it, releasing a rush of foul swamp water and debris. The interior was completely flooded and filled with silt. Everything was covered in a thick layer of mud. Bennett and his team would need to carefully document and search the interior, but that would take time and proper facilities. The RV was transported to a secure facility where it could be properly examined. The license plates, though corroded and barely legible, appeared to be from Ohio. Bennett ran what numbers he could make out through the database. Within hours, he had a match. The vehicle was registered to Frank William Donnelly of Cincinnati, Ohio. Bennett immediately contacted the Cincinnati Police Department. The news reached the Donnelly family that same evening. Patricia received the call at 7:30 in the evening. A detective from Louisiana explained they'd found a vehicle matching her parents' RV submerged in a swamp. Her first question was whether anyone was inside. The detective couldn't answer yet. They were still processing the vehicle. Patricia immediately called Michael and Thomas. By the next morning, all three siblings were on a plane to Baton Rouge. Detective Bennett them at the airport and drove them to the facility where the RV was being examined. He warned them it would be difficult to see. Nothing could have prepared them for the sight of their parents' beloved motorhome, transformed into a shell covered in mud and decay. Patricia broke down crying. Michael stood silently, his jaw clenched. Thomas had to step outside for air. Bennett explained that investigators were carefully searching the interior, documenting everything before disturbing any potential evidence. The siblings were allowed to look through the windows, but the silt-covered interior revealed little. Forensic technicians spent 3 days methodically searching the RV's interior. They used water pumps to remove the standing water, then carefully sifted through the mud and debris. What they found painted a troubling picture. Personal belongings were scattered throughout, including clothing, toiletries, and books. Evelyn's purse was found wedged between the driver and passenger seats. Inside was her wallet with identification, $73 in cash, and credit cards. Frank's wallet was discovered in the glove compartment, containing his driver's license and $142. The presence of these items immediately ruled out robbery as a motive. Luggage was still packed in the overhead compartments, suggesting they hadn't been staying anywhere when whatever happened occurred. The kitchen area contained spoiled food and supplies consistent with an active trip. But 2 things were notably absent. There were no human remains in the vehicle, and there were no obvious signs of what had caused the RV to end up in the swamp. As technicians continued their examination, they made several significant discoveries. The RV's ignition was in the off position, and the keys were missing. They were never found despite thorough searching both inside the vehicle and in the surrounding swamp area. The steering wheel showed no signs of being in a turned position, suggesting the RV had gone straight into the water rather than swerving. The windshield on the driver's side had a large impact point, with cracks radiating outward, but this damage was consistent with something hitting it from outside rather than from within. The passenger side mirror was torn off, and there was scraping damage along that side of the vehicle. Most puzzling were the vehicle's doors. The main entry door was closed but unlocked. The emergency exit window in the back was open approximately 6 inches. Investigators debated what this meant. Had someone partially opened it trying to escape, or had water pressure forced it open over time? Detective Bennett worked with accident reconstruction specialists to understand how the RV ended up where it was found. The location was significant. It wasn't near any paved roads or established boat launches. The nearest road was a small parish road about half a mile away. Between that road and where the RV was found lay dense swamp forest, thick undergrowth, and unstable ground. There was no clear path a vehicle could have taken. The specialists examined aerial photographs and topographical maps from the early 1980s. They discovered that during that period there had been a logging operation in the area. Old logging roads, now completely overgrown and invisible, had existed throughout the swamp. These roads were rough, rarely maintained, and known only to loggers and a few locals. They weren't marked on any standard maps. It was theoretically possible that the Donnellys had taken one of these roads, either by mistake or intentionally, though why they would remain unclear. The Atchafalaya Basin has a dark reputation among locals. It's a place where people can disappear easily, where the dense vegetation and murky waters hide secrets. Over the years, numerous vehicles have been found in its waters, some with tragic stories attached. The area where the Donnellys' RV was discovered was particularly isolated. In 1982, it would have been even more remote. Local residents told investigators that the logging roads were dangerous, prone to flooding, and often washed out without warning. Several people had gotten lost in the swamp over the years, some never found. The roads weren't intended for recreational vehicles. They were meant for logging trucks with specialized equipment and experienced drivers. If the Donnellys had somehow ended up on one of these roads, perhaps messled by poor signage or outdated maps, they would have been in serious danger. The roads often ended abruptly at water's edge, with little warning. Based on the evidence, investigators attempted to reconstruct the Donnellys' final days. Their last confirmed gas station transaction was in Shreveport on March 19th. The Atchafalaya Basin was approximately 150 miles south of Shreveport, roughly a 3-hour drive under normal conditions. According to their itinerary, they should have been heading west toward Texas, not south into central Louisiana. Detective Bennett theorized they might have taken a wrong turn or decided to change their route. Perhaps they'd heard about the Atchafalaya from other travelers and wanted to see it. The swamp was, after all, a unique natural area that might appeal to curious tourists. Bennett contacted the Louisiana Department of Transportation to obtain road signs and maps from 1982. What he found was troubling. Several roads in the region had confusing or missing signage during that period. It was entirely plausible that the Donnellys had taken a wrong turn and ended up on an unmarked logging road. The partially open emergency exit window haunted investigators. Forensic experts carefully examined it, looking for any evidence that might explain its position. The window was designed to push outward in emergencies, and it appeared to have been opened from the inside. This suggested that someone, presumably Frank or Evelyn, had been trying to escape the vehicle. But if they'd managed to open the window and get out, where were they? The swamp around where the RV was found was extensively searched. Cadaver dogs were brought in, scanning the area for any sign of human remains. Divers searched the murky water in an expanding radius from the vehicle's location. Nothing was found. One theory suggested that if either Frank or Evelyn had escaped into the swamp, they might have become disoriented and succumbed to the elements. The Atchafalaya is unforgiving to those unfamiliar with it. Alligators, venomous snakes, and the risk of drowning made survival unlikely for someone lost in its depths. Detective Bennett cross-referenced the Donnellys' case with every unidentified body found in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Arkansas since March 1982. He went through reports one by one, comparing descriptions, ages, and timing. Several possibilities emerged, but none matched perfectly. In May 1982, an unidentified woman's body was found in a bayou near Lafayette, Louisiana, about 30 miles from where the RV was discovered. However, the woman was significantly younger than Evelyn would have been. In August of that year, a man's body was found near the Texas border, but he died from a gunshot wound, which didn't fit the scenario. Over the 5 years since the Donnellys disappeared, dozens of bodies had been discovered in the region, but none could be definitively connected to them. DNA testing was not yet widely available for identification purposes in 1987, which made definitive matching difficult. The Donnelly children provided dental records and medical information, but no matches were made. The discovery of the RV generated significant media coverage across Louisiana and neighboring states. Detective Bennett held a press conference, showing photos of Frank and Evelyn Donnelly and asking anyone with information to come forward. The story was featured on local news broadcasts and in newspapers throughout the Gulf South. Several people called with tips, but most led nowhere. One witness reported seeing an RV matching the description at a rest stop near Alexandria, Louisiana, in late March 1982. The witness remembered because the couple seemed confused about directions and were studying a map. However, the witness couldn't be certain of the exact date or even confirm it was definitely the Donnellys. Another caller claimed to have seen a similar RV on a remote road near the swamp around the same time period. But again, the details were vague and uncorroborated. The problem with witness accounts from 5 years earlier was the reliability of human memory. People often conflated different memories or filled in gaps with assumptions. Investigators tracked down the logging company that had operated in the Atchafalaya Basin during early 1982. The company's foreman, a man named Gerald Thompson, remembered the time period well. His crew had been working in that section of the swamp from February through early April. They used several makeshift roads to transport cut timber. Thompson explained that they'd put up temporary signs directing their trucks, but those signs weren't designed for public use and weren't standardized. He admitted that occasionally, civilians would wander onto the logging roads, usually hunters or fishermen familiar with the area. However, he couldn't recall ever seeing a recreational vehicle on those roads. Thompson pointed out that the roads weren't safe for regular vehicles. They were often muddy, could wash out unexpectedly, and had spots where the ground was barely stable enough to support heavy equipment. For an RV, they would have been treacherous. Several of the roads ended right at the water's edge, with no barriers or warnings. Meteorological records from March 1982 revealed an important detail. Between March 18th and 21st, severe thunderstorms had moved through central Louisiana. Rainfall was heavy, causing flash flooding in many areas. Water levels in the Atchafalaya Basin rose significantly, and several roads were temporarily impassable. Detective Bennett obtained specific weather data for March 19th and 20th. On the 19th, the day of the Donnellys' last known transaction, storms began developing in the late afternoon. By evening, conditions were severe with heavy rain, lightning, and poor visibility. If the Donnellys had been traveling on back roads during this weather, their situation would have been dangerous. A logging road that was marginally passable in good weather could become a muddy trap in the rain. Bennett theorized that they might have been trying to find shelter or a way back to the main highway when they encountered trouble. Based on all the evidence, investigators developed a working theory of what happened. Sometime on March 19th or 20th, the Donnellys made a wrong turn, possibly exacerbated by storm conditions and poor visibility. They ended up on an unmarked logging road leading into the Atchafalaya Basin. As they attempted to navigate the rough road, perhaps looking for a place to turn around, they encountered increasingly difficult conditions. The road may have been washed out or obscured by rising water. In the darkness and rain, they didn't realize they were approaching the end of the road until it was too late. The RV went into the water, possibly nose first based on how it was found. The impact with the water could have caused the windshield damage observed. Once in the water, the heavy vehicle would have sunk quickly. Frank and Evelyn would have had only moments to react. One or both of them may have attempted to escape through the emergency window, but the circumstances, darkness, disorientation, the shock of cold water, would have made survival extremely difficult. Not everyone accepted the accident theory. Some investigators, including Detective Walsh from Cincinnati, who'd followed the case closely, questioned certain aspects. If it was a simple wrong turn and accident, why had the Donnellys deviated so far from their planned route? Their last confirmed location in Shreveport was 150 miles from where the RV was found, and it was in the wrong direction from where they should have been heading. Walsh suggested that perhaps they'd been forced off their route by someone with ill intentions. The missing keys bothered him. Why weren't they in the ignition or somewhere in the vehicle? He proposed that someone might have attacked them, forced them to drive to the remote location, and then disposed of them. The open emergency window could indicate they'd been trapped in the vehicle by an assailant. However, this theory had significant problems. Nothing was stolen. Money and valuables were left in the RV. There was no forensic evidence of another person in the vehicle. As word spread through local communities about the discovered RV, some longtime residents shared a disturbing story that had circulated for years. In late March 1982, several people in the small town of Bayou Sorrel, about 15 miles from where the RV was found, reported seeing an unfamiliar recreational vehicle driving slowly through town. The vehicle had out-of-state plates and appeared to be driven by an elderly couple. What made the sighting memorable was that the couple allegedly stopped to ask for directions, but seemed confused about where they were trying to go. One resident, Martha Broussard, told investigators she'd been working at a small general store when an elderly couple came in looking distressed. The man explained they'd gotten lost trying to find a campground, and their map didn't show their current location. Martha had given them directions back to the main highway, but she wasn't certain they understood. She remembered thinking they looked exhausted and worried. When shown photos of the Donnellys, she believed it might have been them. Detective Bennett mapped out a possible timeline using Martha Broussard's account and other fragmentary information. If the Donnellys had been in Bayou Sorrel in late March, they were significantly off their planned route. The town was a small, isolated community that wouldn't be on any typical tourist path. Bennett theorized they might have been trying to find a route to Interstate 10, which ran east-west across Louisiana and would have taken them toward Texas. In the confusion of back roads, perhaps exacerbated by their growing concern about being lost, they may have taken increasingly poor roads in an attempt to find the highway. The logging road could have seemed like it might lead somewhere promising, or, perhaps in the rain and darkness, they simply didn't realize what kind of road they were on until too late. Local fishermen told Bennett that the area where the RV ended up was particularly deceptive. The road appeared to continue, but actually stopped abruptly at the water's edge, obscured by vegetation. Despite the passage of 5 years, investigators organized another comprehensive search of the swamp area. Volunteers from local parishes joined law enforcement in systematically combing through the difficult terrain. They searched for any sign of Frank or Evelyn, clothing, personal items, or human remains. The search lasted 2 weeks and covered several square miles around where the RV was found. The process was grueling. The swamp was hot, humid, filled with mosquitoes and treacherous underfoot. Searchers waded through chest-deep water, checked hollow logs, and explored countless small islands of solid ground. Cadaver dogs worked alongside human searchers, but the environment made their job difficult. Decomposition in swamp conditions, especially after 5 years, would leave little scent for dogs to detect. The search ultimately found nothing connected to the Donnellys. They did discover some old personal items, a shoe, some bottles, scattered trash, but none of it was related to the case. The vastness of the Atchafalaya became painfully apparent. If Frank and Evelyn were in that swamp, finding them might be impossible. In an attempt to match the Donnellys to any unidentified remains that had been found, investigators obtained their dental records from their Cincinnati dentist. These records were distributed to medical examiners throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and eastern Texas. Every unidentified body from the past 5 years that roughly matched their ages was re-examined. Several bodies that had been found in water or isolated areas received particular attention. The remains of a woman found in 1983 near the Arkansas-Louisiana border were carefully compared to Evelyn's dental profile, but ultimately ruled out. A man's body discovered in 1984 in northeast Texas was examined against Frank's records with the same negative result. The process was methodical but frustrating. Many bodies found in rural areas are never identified, and some remains had been found in conditions that made identification difficult or impossible. The Donnelly children lived in agonizing limbo, hoping that identification would bring closure, but dreading what that closure would mean. Among the items recovered from the RV, several were particularly poignant. Evelyn's carefully prepared binder with their trip itinerary was found, its pages now fused together by water and time. Investigators carefully separated what pages they could, revealing the couple's detailed plans. Maps with routes highlighted, lists of campgrounds with phone numbers, notes about attractions they wanted to visit. Frank's toolbox was recovered intact. His meticulous nature was evident in how carefully each tool was organized. Even after years underwater, a camera was found with film still inside. Though damaged by water, forensic technicians attempted to develop the film. A few images were partially recovered, showing the couple at various stops in Kentucky and Tennessee, smiling and enjoying their journey. The last partially visible photo showed them standing in front of their RV at an unidentified location. Both looked happy and healthy. These glimpses into their trip made their disappearance even more heartbreaking. The missing keys remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Investigators searched the RV's interior exhaustively, then expanded their search to the surrounding swamp. Metal detectors were used, covering a wide area around where the vehicle was found. The keys were never located. Several theories were proposed. Perhaps they'd been in Frank's pocket when he attempted to escape the vehicle, and he'd lost them in the swamp. Maybe they'd been thrown from the RV during the crash into the water. Or possibly, as Detective Walsh continued to suggest, someone had taken them. The key ring also held keys to their Cincinnati home and Frank's personal car that had been left at their house. Without the keys, accessing their home would require breaking in, which might have deterred potential burglars who thought the house was occupied. The mystery of the keys became symbolic of all the unanswered questions in the case. A small but significant detail that didn't fit neatly into any explanation. For Patricia, Michael, and Thomas, the discovery of the RV brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. After 5 years of not knowing, they finally had some answers, but not the ones they truly needed. They knew where their parents' vehicle had been, but not what had happened to Frank and Evelyn themselves. The lack of remains meant they couldn't have a funeral, couldn't achieve the closure that comes with laying loved ones to rest. Patricia struggled particularly hard. She'd been the last family member to speak with her mother. That brief phone call from Nashville. She replayed that conversation in her mind constantly, searching for any sign she'd missed, any indication her mother was worried or afraid. But there had been nothing, just excitement about the journey ahead. Michael dealt with his grief by becoming obsessed with understanding every detail of the investigation. He read every report, studied maps of the area, and even traveled to Louisiana multiple times to see the swamp for himself. The case attracted significant media attention, not just regionally, but nationally. Television news magazines featured the story, presenting it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rural travel and the importance of staying on marked roads. Some coverage was sensationalized, suggesting sinister theories without evidence. Other reporting was more measured, focusing on the genuine mystery of what had happened. The Donnelly children participated in some interviews, hoping that publicity might generate new leads. Patricia appeared on a national morning show, making an emotional appeal for anyone with information to come forward. The exposure did generate tips, dozens of them, but none proved valuable. Psychics and amateur sleuths contacted the family, offering theories ranging from alien abduction to organized crime connections. Investigators had to sort through these claims, following up on anything remotely credible while filtering out obvious nonsense. The media attention gradually faded, though the case periodically resurfaced in true crime articles and documentaries. The Louisiana State Medical Examiner's Office became involved in determining what could be concluded about Frank and Evelyn's fate. Without bodies, they couldn't issue death certificates with a specific cause of death. However, based on the evidence, they could make certain assessments. The medical examiner, Dr. Helen Martinez, reviewed all the findings. She noted that if Frank and Evelyn had been in the RV when it entered the water and had been unable to escape, drowning would be the likely cause of death. The pressure and speed at which the vehicle, filled with water, would have made escape difficult, especially for people in their late 50s and early 60s who might not be strong swimmers. However, Dr. Martinez couldn't explain the absence of remains. Bodies don't simply disappear, even in swamp conditions. Decomposition is rapid in warm, wet environments, but skeletal remains should persist. Alligators and other scavengers might account for some dispersal of remains, but complete absence was unusual. She recommended the case be classified as complete absence was unusual. She recommended the case be classified as a presumed drowning with the victim's location unknown. This classification allowed the family to eventually obtain death certificates, which would be necessary for settling the estate, but it provided little emotional closure. Dr. Martinez also noted that the open emergency window suggested at least one person had survived the initial impact and attempted escape. This possibility haunted the family. The thought that their parents might have made it out of the RV only to perish in the swamp, alone and frightened in the darkness. Swamp ecology experts were consulted to understand what might happen to human remains in the Atchafalaya Basin environment. Professor Donald Richards from Louisiana State University explained that the swamp's ecosystem is incredibly efficient at breaking down organic matter. The warm water temperatures, high acidity from decaying vegetation, and abundance of scavengers create conditions where soft tissue decomposes rapidly. Alligators, which were plentiful in the area, are opportunistic feeders that would consume carrion. Large catfish, turtles, and various invertebrates also play roles in decomposition. Professor Richards explained that skeletal remains could be scattered over a wide area by water currents, animal activity, and seasonal flooding. In the 5 years since the Donnellys disappeared, the swamp had experienced several flood cycles that could have moved remains considerable distances. He acknowledged that while complete disappearance was uncommon, it wasn't impossible, especially if the bodies had entered areas with strong currents or deep soft mud that could bury remains. By late 1987, the Donnelly children faced difficult decisions. Their parents' house in Cincinnati had sat empty for over 5 years. Bills had accumulated, and the property needed attention, though it was painful. They needed to settle their parents' estate. The legal process was complicated by the lack of bodies. Ohio law required a certain period to pass before someone could be declared legally dead when remains weren't found. The discovery of the RV in Louisiana helped establish that Frank and Evelyn had died, even though their bodies weren't recovered. The probate court processed the death certificates based on the coroner's assessment. The children inherited their parents' modest estate: the house, some savings, personal possessions. Cleaning out the house was emotionally devastating. Every item held memories. Frank's workshop with his carefully organized tools. Evelyn's library, books organized by author and genre. Photo albums documenting their 40 years together. The children divided meaningful items among themselves and donated what they couldn't keep. The house was sold in early 1988. Despite the official conclusion, Detective Lawrence Bennett couldn't fully accept the accident theory. Several details bothered him beyond the missing keys. He obtained the Donnellys' detailed itinerary from Patricia and studied it carefully. The couple had been meticulous planners who researched their route thoroughly. How did such careful people end up so far off course? Bennett drove the route they should have taken multiple times, trying to understand how they could have made such a significant navigational error. He also investigated the gas station in Shreveport, where they'd made their last purchase. The station attendant from 1982 no longer worked there, but Bennett tracked him down. The man vaguely remembered tourists stopping frequently during that period, but couldn't specifically recall the Donnellys. Bennett requested the original credit card receipt from the station's archives. When he finally obtained it, he noticed it was signed by Frank with no indication of distress. The timestamp showed 3:47 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight remaining for safe travel. Bennett developed a theory that the Donnellys might have intentionally changed their route. Perhaps they'd heard about an attraction or scenic area that wasn't on their original itinerary. He researched what points of interest existed in central Louisiana in 1982 that might appeal to tourists. The Atchafalaya Basin itself was promoted as America's largest river swamp, and some tourist materials suggested scenic drives through the area. However, those recommended routes stayed on paved highways with proper signage. Bennett wondered if someone had given the Donnellys incorrect directions to a viewing area or campground. He interviewed longtime residents of towns throughout the region, asking if there had been any tourist attractions or campgrounds in the area that might have drawn visitors. One elderly man mentioned that in the early 1980s, there was an unofficial camping spot popular with fishermen near the swamp. It wasn't a proper campground, just a clearing where people sometimes parked RVs. Access required knowing about an unmarked turnoff from a parish road. Could the Donnellys have been trying to find this spot? Bennett returned to Martha Broussard, the store clerk who believed she'd given directions to the Donnellys. He asked her to recall exactly what the couple had asked and what directions she'd given. Martha closed her eyes, trying to remember details from 5 years earlier. She said the man had mentioned they were trying to reach Interstate 10 to head west toward Texas. She'd told them to go back the way they'd come for about 8 miles, then turn right at the fork. That would take them to Highway 318, which connected to Interstate 10. But Martha admitted the directions might have been confusing. The fork she'd mentioned wasn't clearly marked, and there was another turn that looked similar just a few miles before it. If they'd taken that earlier turn, they would have ended up heading deeper into swamp country. Martha felt terrible, wondering if her directions had inadvertently sent them to their deaths. Bennett assured her she wasn't responsible. The roads should have been better marked, but the possibility haunted her. In 1988, a forensic review team re-examined all physical evidence from the RV. New technologies and methodologies had emerged even in the short time since the discovery. The team focused particularly on the windshield damage, the scraped passenger side, and the open emergency window. Enhanced photography revealed details that hadn't been initially noticed. The scraping on the passenger side showed paint transfer, dark paint that didn't match the RV's white and orange exterior. Analysis suggested it was automotive paint, possibly from another vehicle. This finding revived questions about whether another vehicle had been involved. Had someone sideswiped them, perhaps forcing them off the road, or had they scraped against a tree or post while navigating the narrow logging road? The team also examined the emergency window mechanism closely. They found that considerable force would have been required to open it, suggesting someone had pushed hard, likely in a panic. Small fibers were found on the window's edge, consistent with clothing from the era. In 1990, the case was officially transferred to the Louisiana State Police Cold Case Unit. Detective Sarah Landry took over the investigation. She brought fresh eyes to the evidence and immediately focused on the paint Transfer Bennett's team had found. She had it analyzed using newer spectrographic methods. The results indicated the paint was from a vehicle manufactured in the late 1970s or early 1980s, dark blue or black in color. This could have been from another civilian vehicle or possibly a logging truck. Landry tracked down former employees of the logging company that had operated in the area. She interviewed 12 former workers, asking if any remembered seeing an RV or having any incidents involving civilian vehicles during March 1982. Most remembered nothing useful, but one man, Carl Jennings, recalled something that gave Landry pause. He said there had been an incident where a logging truck had accidentally scraped a civilian vehicle on one of the logging roads. The truck driver had been disciplined, and the company had paid for damages. Carl Jennings' memory was vague on details. The incident had occurred sometime in the spring of 1982, but he couldn't pinpoint the exact date. He didn't remember what kind of civilian vehicle was involved, only that it was unusual to see non-logging vehicles on those roads. The truck driver involved, a man named Wayne Dupree, had left the company years ago. Detective Landry tracked Dupree down to a small town in Texas. Now in his 60s and retired, Dupree initially claimed not to remember any such incident. However, when Landry showed him photos of the Donnellys' RV as it had been found, his demeanor changed. He admitted he might have had a close call with a similar vehicle, but insisted there hadn't been any serious accident. He claimed he'd been backing his loaded logging truck around a tight curve when he saw a white RV coming toward him on the narrow road. Both vehicles had stopped, and after some careful maneuvering, they'd passed each other. He said he might have scraped the RV slightly, but nothing significant. Under further questioning, Wayne Dupree provided more details. He remembered the incident occurring late in the day, possibly around sunset, and it might have been raining or just finished raining. The road was slick with mud. He recalled that the RV seemed out of place, not the kind of vehicle that should have been on a logging road. He'd been surprised to see it there. The driver was an older man who appeared stressed or confused. Dupree said he'd briefly spoken to the driver, asking what he was doing on that road. The man had explained they were looking for Highway 318 and had taken a wrong turn. Dupree had given him directions to get back to the main parish road, though he admitted the directions might not have been clear. He'd pointed back the way the RV had come and said to turn left at a junction about a mile back. Dupree insisted he'd watched the RV carefully turn around and head back. He'd assumed they made it out without problems. Dupree's account created a new puzzle. If he'd directed the Donnellys back toward safety and had seen them heading in the right direction, how did they still end up where their RV was found? Detective Landry obtained maps of all the logging roads from that period. She traced the route Dupree described and compared it to where the RV was discovered. The location didn't match up. If the Donnellys had been where Dupree encountered them and had followed his directions, they should have reached the parish road safely. The RV was found in a different section of the swamp entirely. Either Dupree's memory was faulty, or something had happened after his encounter with them. Landry considered several possibilities. Perhaps they'd gotten lost again after leaving Dupree. Maybe they'd encountered another junction and taken a wrong turn. Or possibly Dupree's account wasn't entirely accurate, whether due to faulty memory or for other reasons. Without additional evidence, determining the truth was impossible. As the 1990s progressed, the Donnelly case remained open but largely inactive. Every few years, new investigators would review the file, hoping fresh perspectives might reveal something missed. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. How did Frank and Evelyn end up so far from their planned route? What exactly happened when their RV went into the water? Did they both attempt to escape, or did only one survive the initial crash? Where are their remains? The case appeared periodically in true crime publications and television shows. Each retelling brought new speculation, but no concrete answers. The Donnelly children, now middle-aged, had learned to live with uncertainty. They'd held a memorial service without bodies, marking a headstone in Cincinnati with their parents' names and the dates of their disappearance. Patricia became involved with organizations supporting families of missing persons, channeling her grief into helping others navigate similar situations. Michael maintained contact with Louisiana law enforcement, calling periodically to check if any new evidence had emerged. Today, more than 40 years after Frank and Evelyn Donnelly set out on their anniversary trip, their disappearance remains one of Louisiana's most perplexing unsolved cases. The discovery of their RV in 1987 answered some questions, but raised countless others. Were they victims of a tragic accident, confused tourists who made a fatal wrong turn on an unmarked road during a storm? Or was there more to the story? a chance encounter with danger, a sequence of mishaps that cascaded into tragedy. The Atchafalaya Basin, vast and indifferent, keeps its secrets. Somewhere in its murky waters, or beneath its soft, mud floor, might lie the final answers. Or perhaps the swamp has already reclaimed Frank and Evelyn entirely, processing their remains through its efficient ecosystem until nothing recognizable remains. Their children have aged, had families of their own, but the absence of closure lingers. The case reminds us that even in our modern, connected world, people can vanish remarkably completely. Sometimes the wilderness still wins, leaving only questions in its wake. What really happened to Frank and Evelyn Donnelly on that rainy March evening in 1982? We may never truly know. This gripping tale of vanished lives reminds us why cold cases and unsolved mysteries continue to captivate us. The investigation into missing persons, like the Donnellys, reveals how families, searching for closure, navigate heartbreak and hope, never forgetting those who disappeared without a trace. These stories of last-seen moments, forensic evidence, and witness accounts echo the true crime documentaries and detective case files that haunt our collective memory. The eerie secrets hidden in forgotten places, the psychological drama of waiting for breakthrough moments. These elements make such mysteries unforgettable. What haunting enigma will we explore next? Subscribe to uncover more gripping tales where the search for truth never ends, and memories refuse to fade into darkness.